There are things that never appear on any map, not because they never existed, but because they passed through the world too early, long before humans learned how to name everything they saw. The earth beneath our feet is only the newest version of a planet that never stops changing, a place that once held plains wide enough to sustain tens of thousands of generations, only to let them vanish as quietly as breath when the seas shifted. Sometimes humanity's memory does not begin with writing, but with the feeling that something is missing, a dim hollow where history should have been full. It's the feeling you get when a fisherman hauls up a stone smoothed by ancient hands, or when a seafloor scanner sweeps across the dark and reveals faint curves that look like the ghost of an old riverbank, or when an old legend speaks of a land lying deeper than the horizon. It isn't because we have truly seen these places, it's because the world has lost so many things that its silence has become a sign. These lost lands, no longer above water, no longer beneath our feet, still leave a trace of themselves in us, a memory of places that no longer exist, yet somehow continue shaping who we are in ways we do not fully understand. Perhaps they do not come to us in the form of ruins or shattered stones, but through quiet questions. Why is the sea so flat here? Why does this place feel as though it was once deeper or wider? And why does the collective imagination of humanity always return to the image of a land taken by water? Tonight, we are not searching for absolute answers. We are simply listening to what the world once forgot. Because sometimes the things that sink do not disappear. They only change the way they whisper to us. There are things that never appear on any map, not because they were imaginary, but because they moved through the world too early, long before humans knew how to name the things they loved or feared. The earth beneath our feet is only the latest version of a restless planet, a place that once held plains wide enough to shelter countless generations, only to let them fade, soft as a breath, when the seas shifted their course. Sometimes humanity's memory doesn't begin with writing at all, but with the quiet sense that something is missing, a dim hollow where history should feel complete. It's the feeling that rises when a fisherman lifts a stone worn smooth by ancient hands, when a scanner glides across the seafloor and reveals curves shaped like the ghost of an old river, or when an old legend whispers about a land resting deeper than the horizon. It's not because we have truly seen these places, it's because the world has lost so much that its silence has become a signal. These vanished lands, no longer above the waves, no longer beneath our steps, still leave a thin layer of memory within us, echoes of places that no longer exist, yet continue to shape who we are in ways we barely understand. Maybe they do not reach us through ruins or broken stones, but through gentle questions. Why is the sea so calm here? Why does this land feel like it was once deeper, wider, or more alive? And why does the human imagination across every age return again and again to the image of a world claimed by water? Tonight, we're not here to chase absolute answers. We're simply here to listen to what the world once forgot. Because sometimes the things that sink do not disappear. They simply find a different way to whisper to us. When we try to imagine Doggerland, the hardest part is not picturing a land now buried beneath the sea. It is imagining the lives that once stretched across it. A continent erased from the map usually feels distant or strange, Yet Doggerland is startlingly familiar: plains, riversides and forests that look no different from the ones we know today, now resting under the cold, muted waters of the North Sea. If you stood on those ancient plains on some far-off afternoon, you might hear the heavy footsteps of aurochs pounding the ground, the scrape of a giant elk rubbing its antlers against a tree, and the softest echo of waves in the distance. Back when the old sea was only a narrow band of water. Doggerland moved to the rhythm of nature, slow but full of life, like an old reel of film turning steadily through the seasons. In that world, Mesolithic people lived so closely with the landscape that they left almost no trace behind. They were not wanderers drifting without purpose. They were communities who knew every fish-rich marsh, every wind-swept lakeshore, every river that swelled with meltwater in spring. They understood the birds that marked each season, the direction of winds that carried danger, and the patches of ground that could shelter an entire group. Small rituals sometimes took place along the forest's edge. Smoothed stones that seemed oddly deliberate, fire pits that burned far longer than an ordinary meal required, or a few arranged rocks forming a quiet crescent. We may never know what these acts meant, but they tell us that Mesolithic people did more than survive. They thought, remembered, and connected their world through a logic that belonged to their own time. Today, most of what we know comes from objects accidentally caught in fishermen's nets: a fossilized deer bone, a broken spear tip, a stone axe still holding grains of sea sand. None of them belong to a complete context. No villages, no graves, no intact sites. Only small things pulled from the sea floor, like memories, unexpectedly stirred awake. Fragile as they are enough to suggest a world that once existed with full clarity and life. From these fragments we can trace a life built on memory and patient observation. They knew when the waters rose, where plants returned after winter, and which paths fish followed when the summer heat arrived. That knowledge carried them through generations, but it was not enough to withstand the slow, relentless shift of climate. The ground grew wetter, marshes spread, familiar trails changed shape year after year. Perhaps they sensed the transformation, yet could not grasp its scale. Even a community who knew every inch of its homeland might not recognize that they were living on land in the final years of its life. It is a quiet paradox. They understood every footprint of an animal, every shift of wind, yet they could not understand the force that was remaking their world. Low valleys turned into new lakes, old paths filled with water. Everything seemed manageable until suddenly it was not. The bond between the people and Doggerland is what moves us most. They belonged deeply to that land, yet memory and experience could not save it. And when the sea advanced, it took more than soil. It swallowed stories, rituals, and the entire vocabulary of a world. And so the final question emerges: what happens when a continent reaches its last threshold, when people must face the truth that a familiar world can vanish within a handful of generations? The answer lies in the moment Doggerland witnessed its most violent transformation, when the sea rose overnight. If in the previous two parts we walked beside the Mesolithic communities of Doggerland, watching them hunt, tend their fires, and live across the vast open plains, then now we must step much farther back, no longer at the eye level of a forest traveller, but at a vantage wide enough to see an entire planet shifting beneath us. Because to understand why a continent disappears, We have to follow the slow but merciless forces that drive it: melting ice, rising seas, and time. When the Ice Age ended, the great ice sheets over North America and northern Europe did not melt in any gentle or predictable way. They melted in uneven pulses, sometimes soft, sometimes abrupt, like the broken breathing of a climate out of rhythm. Scientists call these meltwater pulses, immense releases of glacial water that cause sea levels to rise with astonishing speed. One of the most dramatic meltwater pulse, 1b, unfolded more than 11,000 years ago. The people of Doggerland had no name for such a thing. They only saw their hunting paths turn muddier each season, the high ground becoming small pools, then widening into lakes as the generations passed. What we now express through charts and sea level curves was, for them, the kind of story told beside a fire. When my grandfather was young, there was still a whole forest to the east. The tragedy of a rising sea lies in the mismatch between the pace of the planet and the pace of memory. Just a handful of generations is enough to erase a landscape from daily life. A child born at the water's edge would never believe that the place beneath their feet was once a hunting plain, and the elders' stories, however sincere, would slowly shift into the shape of distant legend. But not all change arrives slowly. Sometimes the ocean moves like a sudden shock. Around 8,000 years ago, off the coast of what is now Norway, a massive shelf of sediment collapsed into the deep sea, sending huge waves sweeping across the northern Atlantic. We call this the Storegga Slide. For the Mesolithic people, it was not a submarine landslide. It was the day the sea surged farther inland than anything they had ever imagined. Imagine that morning, the familiar scent of salt on the wind, the men following animal tracks, the children tossing stones into the newest puddles left by the tide. Then from somewhere far off a strange sound began to rise, low, long, as if the earth itself were shifting. By the time the horizon started to warp, a pale line had already lifted above the water, the sign of a wave approaching. No one knew it came from a collapse in the deep sea. They only knew the water was rushing toward them faster and harder than any storm in living memory. The wave may not have risen like the dramatic walls we see in films, but it was strong enough to tear apart hunting camps, snap trees, sweep away wildlife, and take the lives of anyone caught in its path. When the water finally pulled back, what remained was not just loss, but a profound uncertainty about where the land ended and the sea began. Doggerland likely did not vanish in one single disaster, but through a long chain of rising waters, collapses, strange winters, and summers turned too wet. Yet ice cores, sediments, and climate models all point to a striking truth. In only 4 or 5 generations, the sea could rise enough to erase an entire region from human sight. For the people then, this was not climate change. It was the horizon changing right before their eyes. When we place geological records beside the bones, spear tips and tools pulled from the sea, Doggerland becomes evidence of a larger pattern. Lost continents do not vanish through mystery, but through low land and melting ice, a rule repeated across much of Earth's history. And from that understanding comes a haunting question. If Doggerland, a land barely remembered in legend, could disappear so completely, what do the world's stories of lands swallowed by the sea truly mean? How many myths of drowned cities and vanished kingdoms are really the fading memories of other Doggerlands scattered from Europe to Asia, from the Indian Ocean to the vast Pacific, People once stood on ground now buried under dozens of meters of seawater. They witnessed it, they retold it, and over time their stories shifted, leaving behind only fragments. A land stretching toward the sunrise, a kingdom taken by the sea, a city drowned when the winds changed. Perhaps before we speak of Atlantis or any legendary continent, we must listen to the faintest stories first, because somewhere between science and myth, there may be a narrow bridge, like a tale carried across generations yet never fully lost. And that bridge leads us to the place where we see Doggerland not through numbers, but through what it left in human memory, the memory that became myth. When Doggerland slipped beneath the water, what remained was not the land itself, but the memory of it. Yet human memory is not a fixed object stored neatly in a drawer. It shifts, it blurs, it expands, it reshapes itself according to what each generation can grasp. The people who lived after the Ice Age had no maps, no writing. They kept their old world alive through spoken stories, through nights gathered around the fire. Through each moment the sea crept closer to their homes, and through the questions their children asked while staring toward the horizon. At first the story must have been simple. There used to be a vast land out there. But as the years passed, emotion settled into the telling, regret, then astonishment, then the quiet helplessness that comes when the sea takes more than expected. The next generation added what the original could not express. One day the water came in and carried the land away. In time the story grew symbols, the sun, the ocean, the light, the shadows. Because when an event feels too large to understand, people place it inside the structure of myth. You can hear these echoes across many old European traditions: the land where the sun sets, the kingdom taken by the sea, the plain that once stretched farther than today. These were not the words of literate civilizations, but the remnants of memory from communities who witnessed the sea rising right before their eyes. It's easy to imagine the first storyteller, an elder sitting beside the fire, recounting something he himself had only heard from his father. Children grew up with these stories and passed them on in turn. What had once been a real event, the sea swallowing the plains, slowly became a lesson about the fragility of the world. And from that transformation, myth emerged, crafted as a way for people to hold on to something they feared might vanish forever. What is remarkable is that these stories appear far beyond Europe, from the Inuit of the north to the Aboriginal peoples of Australia, from Polynesian navigators in the Pacific to coastal communities of the Indian Ocean. Hundreds of cultures speak of great lands that sank beneath the sea. When memories this similar appear in places separated by thousands of miles, it becomes hard to dismiss them as simple coincidence. Placed into this global mosaic, Doggerland begins to reveal something larger. The people of the post-Ice Age world were not just speaking of their own fading lands. They were echoing a greater pattern, one in which many continents and plains once existed, then vanished under the force of climate shifts and rising seas. Doggerland is only one fragment of that immense memory, and when we turn our gaze southeastward toward the waters of Southeast Asia dotted with thousands of islands, a strange familiarity settles in. For there, between Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam, the Philippines, and Singapore, once lay a landmass so vast it defies modern imagination. Geologists call it a superplane, larger even than today's India. It was a place ancient humans walked across for hundreds of generations before the ice melted. A place whose memory lingers in legends of great floods, sea spirits, sunken cities and migrations no one could fully explain. A place both real and myth-soaked, where fact and story slowly braided together. A place that makes Doggerland feel like only the opening chapter, when the two are placed side by side. This land carries a familiar name, yet holds far more history than most realize: Sundayland. When we look at the map of Southeast Asia today, we see a region broken into countless islands, straits, and deep blue fragments, as if someone had shattered a giant mirror and scattered its pieces across the sea. Sumatra stretches along the west, Java curves to the south, Borneo rises like a massive pillar in the center, while the Malay Peninsula, the Philippines, and the coast of Vietnam form a sweeping, intricate arc. Judging from this modern picture alone, it feels impossible that all of it was once a single, unbroken landmass, Sunderland. If Doggerland was a drowned plain, then Sunderland was an entire world. At its largest, it covered more than 1.5 million square kilometers, so vast that regions now separated by sea, such as Vietnam, Malaysia, Singapore, Thailand, Myanmar, and all of Indonesia, were once connected by forests and sweeping plains. Imagine this. Standing on the prehistoric coastline of what is now Vung Tau, you could walk all the way to southern Sumatra without touching the sea. Before the warming began, Sunderland was a green heart of Asia, thick tropical rainforests, ancient elephants and rhinoceroses roaming humid valleys, and immense rivers forming a web that nourished both humans and countless species. The ancient Sunda River system, a super network of rivers, once flowed like a giant pulse through this enormous landscape. Many scientists believe Sunderland sheltered modern humans for thousands of years when global climates were still harsh. Some studies describe it as a refugium, a warm, food-rich, stable environment that kept early populations alive through the coldest periods. DNA data, migration models, and archaeological findings all suggest that Sunderland was a launching point for many human branches that later spread across Asia and eventually sailed into Polynesia. Life here carried the signatures of an old world. Volcanic arcs built and destroyed land, raising it and sinking it over millennia. Ancient coral marked long-forgotten shorelines. In these vast forested regions, like a green ocean on land, people lived among abundant resources, freshwater fish, fruit year-round, and herds so large their shadows darkened the ground beneath them. Today, looking at the region, we see only scattered islands. But seafloor maps reveal a different truth. Between Indonesia, Malaysia, and Vietnam once lay enormous plains where the water was so shallow you could see the bottom. Those empty spaces were once land connecting land, a true continent. If Doggerland was the first warning, Sunderland is the second chapter. Larger, deeper, and full of questions about how humans lived, remembered, and moved. Because if Sunderland truly existed at this scale, then tens of thousands of years of human life unfolded on ground now buried beneath the Java Sea and the South China Sea. There were rituals there, languages, early trading paths, and encounters that shaped the identities of ancient communities, but Sunderland was not still. As the ice continued to melt, the seas rose, slowly at first, then with sudden leaps. Forests turned to marshes, settlements pulled inland, and one day the coastline may have shifted fast enough that those living there could not retreat in time. That memory of running from rising waters echoes in the flood legends of Indonesians, Filipinos, Malaysians, and the ancient peoples of Vietnam. In this way, Sundaland is not just a drowned continent. It is a reminder that a map captures only one temporary moment in Earth's long story. Plains, forests, coastlines, all things we think of as permanent, can change within a few thousand years, far faster than the lifespan of any civilization. And to understand the world of Sundaland more deeply, we must follow the trails of the vanished rivers, the migration routes that opened into the Pacific, and the fertile plains that once supported a vast human lineage. Which leads us to where the story goes next. Rivers, cities, and the great migration pathways. When we see Sundaland not as the fractured archipelago of today, but as a once unbroken continent, the entire region takes on a new meaning. The modern shorelines are only thin outlines redrawn after countless cycles of advancing and retreating seas. To imagine how Sundaland truly lived its long life, we must read the clues that have sunk beneath the waves, the ancient rivers, the buried valleys, and the migration routes now visible only in the DNA of modern people. When we piece them together, what emerges is not just a vast landmass, but a center, a place that may have shaped the earliest human footsteps along the coasts of Asia for tens of thousands of years. What is remarkable is that the sharpest tool for seeing Sundaland does not lie in the soil, but in the human body itself. Genetics, strands of inherited material passed through countless generations, reveal that the peoples of Southeast Asia, East Asia, and many Pacific islands share deep signals from the same ancient journey. When those traces are followed backward, their convergence point does not lie in the frozen north or the steppes of Central Asia, but in the low plains of Sundaland, now hidden under the sea. For decades, scholars debated the path humans took into East Asia. Did they arrive from the cold north or from the warm, forested south? Now, as genetics joins hands with topography, the southern route emerges as the more natural explanation. Early humans likely followed the rivers and coastal paths of Sundaland, moving toward places rich in food and easy to settle. From those wide valleys they spread outward, north into what is now China, east into the Philippines, and beyond into the Pacific, west toward India, and over the mountains into South Asia. What set Sundaland apart was its river network, an immense freshwater system formed when sea levels were much lower. These rivers stretched from Vietnam through Malaysia, from the highlands down toward the Java Sea, creating natural corridors along which humans could travel, camp, and collect food. These waterways were both roads and homes, places to prepare food, hold rituals, and bury the dead. Rivers were humanity's first maps. When topographic reconstructions reveal the shape of the ancient seafloor, those old rivers appear clearly. Long channels, straight ridges, and sweeping curves that resemble any major river system today. Higher ground marks the old settlements. Depressions reveal ancient lakes and marshes. Together they outline a Sundaland once lush, breathing, and alive. The Mesolithic and Neolithic peoples who lived along these waters left only faint traces: charcoal from ancient hearths, flakes of stone tools, grains of pollen buried in sediment. Yet these small remnants suggest that early human gathering points, perhaps the first proto-settlements, could have existed here. Not grand like Mesopotamia or the Nile, but quiet, seasonal communities tool-making camps, places where stories and knowledge were exchanged. We may not know whether they count as cities, but we do know that every civilization begins where people choose to come together. Another surprising hypothesis proposes that Sunderland may have once been a center for early exchange networks. Not trade in the modern sense, no money, no writing, but seasonal exchanges of tools, techniques, stories, and hunting routes. Memory was carried in voices, not symbols, and these gatherings may have occurred for thousands of years, nurturing migration flows that moved like the breathing of the land itself. When the sea began rising rapidly, the lowland communities moved outward in many directions. Some traveled north and blended with ancient Chinese populations. Others went east toward the Philippines, then farther into the Pacific. Still others moved west toward India, climbing the mountains to join the peoples of South Asia. And with each step they carried memories of the great plain behind them, a world now drowned beneath a blue-green sea. What still leaves us speechless is the similarity of flood legends across Southeast Asia. Tales of a shining kingdom lost beneath the water, of plains that once stretched much farther than they do today, of lands that broke apart into islands. The names differ, but the fear is the same, the memory of a world slowly disappearing. When archaeological, geographic, and genetic data sit side by side, Sunderland emerges as a major crossroads in human history, a place where many lineages met before spreading across Asia and the oceans. Its rivers no longer flow, but their story continues, woven into our DNA, into our myths, into migration routes that stretch like threads from past to present. And then, like all lowlands of the post-Ice Age world, Sunderland reached its inevitable moment. The water did not simply rise gently anymore. It rose fast enough that memory could not keep up. Valleys warped, forests retreated, great rivers drowned beneath the sea in less time than a community's lifespan. Which leads us to the question that lingers. What happens when water stops being a natural change and becomes a force capable of rewriting an entire human world? When Sunderland entered its final millennia of the Ice Age, the changes sweeping through it did not resemble the freezing winds or spreading marshlands of the north. Here, everything shifted under the disguise of the tropics: dense, wet forests, massive rivers feeding an entire continent, and rains so long they felt endless. Because of that, the people of Sunderland did not feel they were living on a continent about to vanish. They simply believed that this year's water was fuller than the water of the year before. What made Sunderland truly unique was the constant presence of water. Water in the roar of rain pounding on leaf roofs. Water in the wide rivers that looked like inland seas. Water in the networks of channels that fed fish, silt, and the spiritual life of ancient communities. So when the sea began to rise, it did not enter human life as a single, catastrophic wave, but through subtler signs: salt creeping into river mouths, freshwater fish disappearing from old lakes, lowlands turning so slick that crops could no longer hold to the familiar soil. This change did not arrive year by year. It arrived generation by generation. One lifetime saw the river widen by only a few steps. 2 lifetimes later, the old village no longer had land to build on. By the third, the ancestral valleys existed only as shallow sea floors. What set Sunderland apart was not the speed of the change, but the scale. As waters rose steadily, they did not swallow just valleys or hunting grounds. They consumed entire sections of a continent, including the vast Sunda river system that once stretched for thousands of kilometers and sustained countless communities. The people who lived along those rivers were forced to retreat to higher ground, where the forests grew thicker, food became harder to find, and space slowly narrowed. From a great continent, Sunderland shrank into a chain of peninsulas, from peninsulas into narrow strips of land. Then those strips broke into large islands, and finally, even the large islands fractured into the smaller ones we know today. This process did not produce one dramatic moment, but a century-spanning retreat, each generation giving up a little more of the land, as if the continent were rewriting itself page by page. And with each retreat, people carried small stories of a hill that was once a riverbank, of a forest that once touched the horizon, of a fishing ground that now lay beneath coral and surf. That is why Southeast Asian legends do not describe a single day when the sea came in. They describe a long era. The Malays speak of the day the forest walked into the sea. Indonesian tales recall the homeland breaking into thousands of pieces. Filipino stories speak of shores that kept retreating. Ancient Vietnamese memory preserves the faint image of a plain far wider than today. These stories, though different in words, all describe the same thing, a world melting away, not in panic, but in the slow, fearsome patience of the tropical earth. When sea levels rose by tens of meters, the great Sunda rivers vanished under the Java Sea and the South China Sea. Villages that depended on them disappeared so completely that even their names did not survive. With no ground left to retreat to, people began moving outward in every direction, northward into mainland Asia, eastward into the Philippines, farther still into the Pacific, and southward across narrow straits into new lands. These departures, quiet, repeated, stretching over thousands of years, became the foundation for countless sunken continent legends across the region. And this is what makes Sunderland different from Doggerland. It did not disappear within a few generations, but over a long migration journey, long enough to embed itself into cultural memory. Today, when seafloor reconstructions reveal the ancient Sunda continent, we see the full outline of that tragedy, not a violent crash, not the roar of the ocean, but the slow, relentless reshaping of time. And as the story of Sunderland reaches this turning point, one final question remains. When the land slipped away, what did humans carry with them from the old continent? The answer lies in its rivers, in the cities built from memory, and in the migration paths stretching across Asia like the skeletal remains of a world now underwater. Across the vast Pacific, so wide it makes a person feel small, a place where the sea seems to pull the sky down to meet it, there is something remarkable that few ever notice. The people living on its farthest islands, from Hawaii to Tahiti, from Rapa Nui to Samoa and Tonga, all keep a shared story. They speak of a great land that once lay somewhere beyond the reach of sight, a place where the sun rises, where the sea meets the sky, or where the horizon opens. Each culture paints its own image, but all describe the same thing, a land that is no longer there. Polynesian legends were never meant as simple entertainment. They were memory maps preserved across generations in a world without writing. And when we listen with an archaeologist's ear, these stories do not sound like magic. They sound like longing, the remembrance of an ancient homeland too vast to cross with a single canoe. The Maori call that place Hawaii, the realm where spirits return. The Hawaiians speak of Kahiki, the origin of their ancestors. The Tahitians tell of Hawaii, a world that sank long ago. The Samoans remember Pelotu, a realm between the living and the spirit world. Many names, but all feel like fragments of a single picture, a land too large to be called an island. Some scholars see these stories as symbolic memories of distant homelands. But here is the striking part. Though separated by thousands of kilometers, Polynesian traditions all point toward the same direction, westward, where the sun begins its climb. If only one community told the story, we could call it coincidence. But when dozens of cultures across the ocean repeat the same pattern, the memory may come from something deeper. These stories often include a repeated detail. The ancient land was very wide, without end, a place where you could walk and never see the sea. Descriptions like these go beyond the size of any island. They carry the shape of a continent. Modern science is cautious with any claim about lost continents. Yet when researchers map the Pacific sea floor with stratigraphic models, they find ancient continental rocks buried under thick layers of sediment. Not the ruins of cities from mythology, but fragments of crust that once rose above the water before being pushed down by tectonic forces. These pieces, though scattered and submerged, are the geological echoes of lands that once stood thousands of meters higher, and from this idea the name Lemuria resurfaces. It first appeared in the 19th century when biologists sought to explain the distribution of lemurs. That early hypothesis faded as our understanding of plate tectonics improved. But strangely enough, the name did not vanish. It slipped out of biology, resurfacing in Polynesian lore, in Southeast Asian storytelling, and in oceanographic surveys of microcontinents hidden beneath the Indian Ocean. No one claims that Lemuria existed exactly as mythology describes, but one fact is undeniable: the Pacific holds more submerged land than any other ocean on Earth. And if any people preserved memories of it, it would be the Polynesian navigators, the masters of the open sea. So when they speak of a land where the sun rises, we do not need to accept every mystical detail, but we should not dismiss the story either, because sometimes humanity's memory does not survive in stone or in artifacts. It hides inside stories retold for so long that they refuse to disappear entirely. And when we place these stories beside Doggerland and Sunderland, two real continents swallowed by rising seas, Lemuria, though wrapped in myth, begins to fall into the same current, the current of lands that existed, vanished, and lived on in memory. To understand it, what Lemuria was, why it was remembered, and what lies beneath those dark waters, we must turn our gaze to another ocean, where the fragments of the story sit quietly, waiting to be read. The Indian Ocean. When the name Lemuria appeared in the 19th century, it did not come from Polynesian storytellers or mystics. Ironically, it began at the desks of scientists, people who were simply trying to solve a small biological puzzle, unaware that they were opening a door to a far larger idea. The question was this: why did lemurs live only in Madagascar, yet have close relatives in India and Sri Lanka, while the lands between them showed no trace at all? At that time, the world knew nothing of plate tectonics. No one imagined continents drifting on molten mantle. Lacking the tools we have today, scientists were forced to consider another possibility: that a landmass had once connected Madagascar and India, a landmass that no longer existed, a continent erased from the map. They named it after the animal that inspired the hypothesis, Lemuria. Today, with a clear understanding of continental drift, The old model of Lemuria is easy to dismiss, but the interesting part is not whether the 19th century hypothesis was right or wrong. It is why scientific intuition pointed toward the idea that there must have been land here. Perhaps they were unconsciously responding to subtle geological clues, clues that modern science would only confirm decades later. When sonar mapping surveyed the floor of the Indian Ocean, researchers began to see unusual structures, submerged plateaus like the Mauritius Ridge, small continental fragments such as the microcontinent Mauritia, and mountain chains severed by deep waters. These were not ruins of ancient temples or lost cities, as romantic imaginations once hoped, but pieces of continental crust that had once stood high above sea level for millions of years before being pulled downward by the shifting rhythms of the planet. Strangely, though 19th century science was wrong about the shape, size and placement of Lemuria, it was right about something deeper, that real continental fragments do exist beneath these wide oceans. They do not bear the name Lemuria, but they reveal a truth. Earth is never still. It rises and sinks in cycles far too long for any single human lifetime to witness fully. This leads to an intriguing thought. Perhaps the myth of Lemuria did not arise from pure imagination, but from things ancient peoples actually saw. Land collapsing, volcanoes rising from the sea, high ridges disappearing within a few generations. They could not explain the cause, so they spoke in symbols, in images, in the quiet fear of losing their ground. And over thousands of years of oral storytelling, those memories solidified into the tale of a drowned land. We often place myth and science on opposite sides. Yet in the story of Lemuria, they intersect in an unexpected way. On one side, sediments and ancient rock. On the other, oral memory. When two streams of knowledge from two seemingly separate worlds begin pointing toward the same idea, we start to see the faint outline of a world long lost. Like Doggerland and Sunderland, Lemuria, whether carried by myth or by science, points to a larger truth. Earth once had many lands that vanished so completely that human memory could not help but reflect them as stories. When the memory of the Earth's layers overlaps with the memory of human voices, myth becomes something else, a rough, imperfect, but still fundamentally true record. Lemuria, then, is not just the name of a dismissed continent. It is a reminder that sometimes humans sense the truth long before science proves it. A story that survives across generations may be carrying a piece of memory that time has tried to bury. And to understand Lemuria more deeply, or not only through legend but through the planetary forces that created those memories, we must turn to the place where worlds are born and broken, the ring of fire, and the birth of a myth. To understand why a legend like Lemuria could endure so long in human memory, we have to look deeper, not just beneath the ocean, but into the quiet, relentless movements of Earth's crust. Nothing that rises or sinks on this planet's surface ever happens by chance. These changes are the result of motions that unfold over hundreds of millions of years, where continental plates collide, where volcanoes tear open the mantle, and where land is lifted up or dragged downward through cycles that humans usually witness only at their ending. In the story of Lemuria, the center of all this shifting lies in the Indian Ocean, a body of water long thought to be calm, yet in truth one of the most dynamic regions on Earth. When sonar and radar began mapping its seafloor, the Indian Ocean emerged not as a flat blue plain, but as a rugged landscape plateaus larger than entire countries, volcanic ridges running like buried roads, and fractured continental blocks torn apart like paper pulled too hard. The Kerguelen Plateau is the clearest example. It is as large as Western Europe, and it once stood above the waves. Now it lies quietly beneath cold water, an ancient chunk of continent pressed downward by the planet's shifting motions. Not far away sits the Mascarene Plateau, born from powerful eruptions. And between India and Madagascar, we find microcontinents such as Mauritius, shards of ancient land ripped from a parent continent, set adrift, and eventually lost beneath the ocean's surface. When these geological fragments are laid side by side, something becomes clear. The Lemuria imagined in the 19th century was never a single continent. It was the layered memory of many different lands that rose and sank across tens of millions of years. Islands such as Mauritius, Réunion, and Rodrigues are simply the highest surviving peaks, the few fragments still visible from a world far larger, now swallowed by the sea. This makes the Indian Ocean one of the most unique maps on Earth. Nowhere else holds so many sunken plateaus and fractured continental pieces clustered so closely together. And it is this concentration of buried landscapes that gave rise to the soil from which later myths would grow. For ancient people living along the old coasts of the Indian Ocean, the sight of land collapsing, volcanoes erupting from the seafloor, or coastal highlands disappearing within a few generations would have been unforgettable, and they would have spoken of it the only way they could. When Europeans reached Madagascar, Sri Lanka, or the waters near Sumatra, they heard local communities speak of lands that once existed out there, now replaced by ocean. No one called them Lemuria, that name belonged to science, but the stories carried the same outline: land that once was and then was gone. And as modern geologists listened to these stories, they realized something surprising. Myths are often summaries of very real geological events. Land does not vanish overnight, but it can disappear quickly enough for people to witness each stage. A new island that rises and sinks due to an underwater eruption can easily become the foundation of a tale about a land that appeared and vanished. A drifting continental fragment sliding off the horizon of memory might be retold through symbols long after its origin is forgotten. Across the Indian and Pacific Oceans, many traditions describe the sea as a living force with intention. The ocean eats, the ocean takes back, the ocean claims what belongs to it. This is not superstition. It is the human way of explaining geological changes too vast, too complex to understand. When faced with forces beyond comprehension, people think in symbols, just like Doggerland, just like Sunderland. Lemuria, if understood through Earth's stratigraphy, is not one landmass, but a chain of broken memories, each sunken fragment a chapter, each chapter told in a language both real and dreamlike. Seen through modern eyes, Lemuria appears to be an outdated scientific mistake, but placed in the world of someone living 10,000 years ago, in standing through earthquakes, eruptions, collapsing land and rising seas, we begin to understand how quickly a disappearing world can become a myth. And because it disappeared, it was remembered. And because it was remembered, it became part of humanity's shared memory. From here, the question is no longer, was Lemuria real? But rather, if any land ever existed there, who lived upon it? Who were the people who saw it before it sank? And that is where the story leads us next. The people who might have lived there. When we imagine a drowned land, we often picture collapsed stone columns, moss-covered steps, or ancient ruins resting beneath a blue-green haze. But in reality, most of what once existed has already been ground into silt, carried away by currents, and sealed beneath thick layers of sediment. What lingers longest is not stone, but people, or more precisely, the subtle traces they left behind in the bodies of their descendants. If Lemuria, in the broad sense of geology and legend, ever had inhabitants, then who were they? What language did they speak, and where did they go when their world dissolved beneath the sea? These questions seem impossible to answer, yet genetics, linguistics, and archaeology begin to sketch surprising outlines. Genetic data reveals something unmistakable. Ancient peoples living along the Indian Ocean moved far more widely than we once imagined. Their migrations stretched north into mainland Asia, but also south and east towards Sumatra, Java, Borneo, and out across the Pacific Islands. In the opposite direction, groups from Southeast Asia traveled westward toward India. These journeys, now separated by vast oceans, were once linked by land bridges, shallow rivers, and coastlines easy to cross. This helps explain the strange genetic threads connecting South India, Sri Lanka, and Southeast Asia, links that late historical trade cannot account for. It also clarifies one of the great puzzles of anthropology: why Madagascar, sitting beside Africa, carries Southeast Asian DNA. A story about an African island speaking a language related to Borneo sounds mythic, yet it is biological fact. It only makes sense when we imagine a world once more connected than today, a world now lost beneath the sea. Language tells the same story. The Dravidian languages of South India remain one of linguistics' great mysteries, unrelated to their neighbours, standing apart like the echo of a long, isolated world. Some scholars have proposed that Dravidian may have roots in the communities that lived on ancient lands along the Indian Ocean, then spread inland as the seas rose. The idea is impossible to prove outright, but when placed beside the map of Sunderland, the submerged fragments of Mauritius, and the memory of Lemuria, it begins to sound less like fantasy and more like a very old whisper. These cultural embers, from genes to languages to legends, never fully die. They smoulder for millennia like coals beneath ash. The Tamil people still tell of a southern land swallowed by the sea. The Malagasy carry Austronesian words like the footprints of distant ancestors. Many Southeast Asian groups faintly recall the time when land touched land, forest touched forest, before the sea split everything into islands. Are these memories coincidence, or are they remnants of a world humans once saw with their own eyes? A world that slipped beneath the waves before anyone understood why. Consider Madagascar, an African island speaking an Austronesian tongue, carrying beliefs and social structures shaped by oceanic life. This is not the mark of late trade. It is the imprint of an ancient migration across the Indian Ocean, a journey requiring navigation memory, survival skill, and the resilience of people accustomed to living on the edges of disappearing lands. If these communities once lived on or near microcontinents like Mauritius, or on land masses now reduced to sunken plateaus, then their memories travelled farther than the land itself, spreading across the Indian Ocean and reaching into the Pacific. Even Tamil classical literature preserves a shadow of this world. The Sangam poems speak of Kumari Kandam, a great southern land taken by the sea, forcing its people to flee and carry their culture with them. Though often dismissed as metaphor, the motif, a flourishing land, rising seas and dispersing populations, echoes Doggerland, Sunderland, and many other lost landscapes. Slowly, a circle closes, the things geology sees on the seafloor, the clues genetics finds in bloodlines, and the hints linguistics hears in isolated languages all point toward the same route. Ancient people once lived on a land that was sinking. They left no stone cities, but they left something far more resistant to water themselves. Their trace lingers in genes, in the shape of languages, and in the spoken memories that travel the rim of the Indian Ocean. And once these pieces fall into place, the next question becomes unavoidable. What happened when that land truly began to drown? The story leads us onward to the vanishing world beneath the Indian Ocean. When we look at a world map, the Indian Ocean appears as a deep, calm expanse of blue, so still and featureless that it feels empty beneath the surface. But beneath that dark water lies a geological history stretching tens of millions of years, a history humanity has never witnessed directly, yet has sensed through legend, genetics, and cultural echoes that drift upward like faint voices from the depths. The pull of Lemuria has never come from whether it existed exactly as imagined, but from the feeling that somewhere in this ocean a world may once have stood. Not quite a supercontinent, but far more than a scatter of islands. Perhaps it was made of overlapping fragments, vast plateaus, torn continental shards, underwater mountain chains etched across the planet like old scars. Seen through the eyes of geology, the seafloor of the Indian Ocean becomes sharply detailed. The Kerguelen Plateau, as large as Western Europe. The microcontinent Mauritia, a broken piece of ancient land, and ridge lines stretching thousands of kilometers beneath the waves. None of this is random. All of it is part of Earth's long rhythm of rising and sinking, where nothing stays still for long. Ancient peoples living around this ocean were close enough to witness these changes in real time. Land subsiding, coastlines retreating, low plains turning to marsh, and entire regions disappearing within only a few generations. Without understanding the mechanisms, they retold these events in stories, in metaphors, in warnings, in images of the sea, eating the land or pulling the earth downward. Perhaps it was from these memories that the name Lemuria, though much younger, found immediate resonance, awakening an old sense of a homeland lost. Today, all that remains are traces, genetic models revealing ancient transoceanic migrations, linguistic families like Dravidian hinting at long-forgotten exchanges, legends from Madagascar, Sri Lanka, Tamil Nadu, and Polynesia repeating the same motif. The sea took the land. None of these prove Lemuria in the traditional sense, yet together they form a dim mirror. We do not see a continent itself, but the memory of one. If we treat memory as its own kind of sediment, we realize that some lands once existed, but were erased so thoroughly that not a single stone remains above water. What endures is the rock on the seafloor and the stories drifting across its surface, each holding half of the world's forgotten history. This does not confirm Lemuria as an ancient empire, but it does show that the disappearance of great land masses is not rare. The world we know is only a thin slice of Earth's long planetary timeline. Every coastline, every continent is just a momentary shape in a cycle that never stops. From this comes a deeper question. If Earth's surface has shifted enough times to erase entire regions, what prevents certain myths, even exaggerated ones, from being echoes of real events? And when we lift our gaze from tectonic maps to the calm horizon, we realize the wonder is not in Lemuria alone, but in the way this planet continuously rewrites itself. Some pages are torn away, some chapters are drowned, but the story never stops moving. And as we leave the Indian Ocean behind, the narrative leads us to something even more astonishing, a continent that is real, a continent vast in scale, a continent almost entirely hidden beneath the sea, not myth, but verified by science. Its name is Zealandia. For centuries, the idea of sunken continents belonged solely to the realm of myth, a place where half-remembered stories and shimmering metaphors lived. Atlantis became an allegory, Lemuria an early scientific attempt to explain the unexplained. But by the late 20th century, as geological maps sharpened and sonar peeled back the ocean's surface, science, careful, cautious science, was forced to confront a reality stranger than legend. Because beneath the deep waters of the southwestern Pacific, a real continent emerged, not a symbol, not an oral memory, not an abandoned hypothesis. A true geological continent with thick continental crust, raised margins, and the full tectonic structure of any landmass still standing above the sea. Its name feels both unfamiliar and strangely poetic. Zealandia. What makes Zealandia so extraordinary is a single astounding number. 94% of it lies underwater. New Zealand, New Caledonia, Norfolk Island. These are merely the lonely mountain tops of a world nearly 5 million square kilometers in size, larger than the entire Indian subcontinent. What we see today is only a handful of sentences left from a chapter long blurred by the ocean. For decades, scientists considered Zealandia nothing more than an extended margin of Australia, a geological oddity, interesting but not quite enough to be called a continent. Yet layer by layer, data began pointing the other way. Its rocks were continental, not oceanic. Its fault boundaries were distinct. Its ancient plateaus and mountain belts were as complete as those of any independent continent. In 2017, after years of debate, a team of 11 geologists from New Zealand and Australia published their conclusion. Zealandia meets every criterion necessary to be recognized as Earth's 8th continent. What people once dismissed as a modern myth turned out to be a straightforward geological truth. When scientists reconstructed Zealandia before its descent, they saw a sweeping landmass stretching from the coast of Australia to New Caledonia, a continent that may once have held rainforests, valleys, and ecosystems unlike anything on Earth today. A fragment torn from the supercontinent Gondwana, drifting and slowly sinking like a waterlogged raft. And from this reconstruction arises the greatest question of all. What happened on Zealandia while it still stood above the surface? Did humans ever set foot on it? Or did it vanish too early to leave behind even the faintest trace of culture? Science still has no answer. But the existence of Zealandia dissolves the boundary between legend and geology. It shows that disappearing continents are not just stories. Earth has done this before, and Zealandia is the clearest proof. While people continue debating Atlantis or Lemuria, Zealandia stands apart. It requires no belief, only maps and measurements. And when we realize that an entire continent can vanish almost completely, without humanity ever knowing, we begin to understand that the world we live in is only a temporary version of a planet in constant motion. To uncover Zealandia more deeply, from its tectonic birth to the slow moment it slipped beneath the waves, we must step into the story written in stone, pressure, and plate movement across millions of years. That story begins in the geological puzzle beneath the waves. There are stories on this earth that have nothing to do with human. Stories that began long before we existed and will continue long after we are gone. Zealandia belongs to that category. A geological chapter so long that no human instinct can fully grasp it, yet powerful enough to reshape the face of the planet. Around 80 million years ago, Zealandia did not lie beneath the sea. It was a complete part of the supercontinent Gondwana, the massive landmass that once connected Africa, South America, Australia, India, and Antarctica. On that ancient map, Zealandia sat beside Australia and stretched toward the edge of Antarctica, not a broken fragment, but a vital piece of the Gondwanan world. But Gondwana began to break apart. Tectonic plates drifted away from one another in a slow, irreversible process. Over tens of millions of years, fault lines widened, pulling Zealandia away from Australia and carrying it northeast, not through violent explosions, but through quiet motion, like a raft being pushed downstream grain by grain. Then Zealandia began to sink, not suddenly and not dramatically, but through the gradual thinning of its continental crust under the planet's constant pull. Valleys flooded first, then plains, then entire basins. Only the highest peaks remained above water, the places we now call New Zealand, New Caledonia, and Norfolk Island. If we could fast forward that entire process like a time-lapse film, Zealandia would appear as a landmass fighting to stay afloat, only to be drawn downward by its own thinning crust. Once the continental layer became too thin to support itself, the land simply could not remain above sea level, and the continent vanished. What touches the heart is not the disappearance itself, but the fact that no one witnessed it. No creature capable of writing was there to remember. A vast continent slipped beneath the waves without leaving behind a legend, without inspiring a myth about its final day. Only silence and the depth of the ocean. Zealandia became a continent without memory, real in its existence, real in its loss, yet absent from every human story. And that leads to a larger thought. If a continent nearly 5 million square kilometers in size can be erased from the surface without anyone knowing, how many other lands once existed and vanished before humans could speak of them? Some continents disappeared with no one left to remember. Some sank before language existed. Some were lost before a single observing eye ever evolved. Zealandia is one of these, and that is precisely what makes it priceless, because Zealandia proves that sunken continents are not distant speculation. Lemuria, Sunderland, Doggerland, each becomes easier to understand when placed beside an example that cannot be denied. Earth has remade itself many times before. And as with all vanished lands, the most important question is not only how Zealandia sank, but this: what was it before it disappeared? A continent of this size must once have held its own ecosystems, its own thriving biological world under the sunlight. To uncover that story, we must turn to the small pieces that still rise above the water today, the fragments carrying the echoes of an entire lost continent. That story begins in life on a fragmented continent. Before it sank almost entirely beneath the sea, Zealandia was not an empty space on a map or a vague name whispered in research labs. It was a complete world, without cities or writing, but filled with the kind of strange, delicate life that only isolated continents can create, subtle, separate, and almost dreamlike, as if nature chose this place to test its most unusual ideas. Imagine Zealandia when it still stood above the ocean, a long, narrow continent stretching thousands of kilometers, its young mountains rising from thin crust, its slopes draped in rainforests, its deep valleys perpetually folded in mist. No one knows exactly what its ecosystems look like, but the remnants that survive on the exposed portion in modern New Zealand suggest that what has been lost must have been far more abundant. If a small fragment like New Zealand could nurture kiwi, kakapo, chest-high ferns, and the giant moa, birds that once walked through the forest like heavy living shadows, then the greater continent must have been a vast green world where no hoofed mammal ever set foot. Haast's eagle, with a wingspan of nearly 3 meters, ruled the skies as the apex predator, a role filled by large mammals everywhere else. In Zealandia, birds were the rulers. The entire ecosystem operated by rules found nowhere else. If ancient humans ever glimpsed the edges of Zealandia before it disappeared, even if only the parts now lost, they would have seen a place that felt both familiar and foreign. A sky so wide it seemed to have an extra layer of depth, colossal birds casting shadows across the ground, rainforests so dense that even midday light felt cold and dim. When Zealandia began to sink, life did not vanish at once. It contracted, gathering along the highest ridges like the fading breath of a world slipping underwater. Valleys became bays, forests turned into marshes, and plains gradually drowned and broke apart. The change was slow enough to avoid catastrophe, yet steady enough that nothing could outrun it. The surviving fragments, the lands we call New Zealand, carried on as the lingering echo of a much greater world. Birds still walked through deep silence, forests still grew, rivers still wound through ancient ridges, unaware that most of their ancestral continent now lay thousands of meters below. Only the ocean remembered. The ocean knew what once existed, and it was the ocean that sealed it away. Zealandia left behind no legend, no human story of its final day. It sank too early for anyone to witness it, too quietly to create a myth. That silence is what makes its story so piercing. Some pieces of the world are lost completely, not because they were small, but because they vanished before any memory existed to preserve them. Zealandia reminds us that Earth has erased vast continents without leaving so much as a trace in human memory. And if a land nearly 5 million square kilometers in size can disappear without being seen, then the stories of Lemuria, Sunderland, or Doggerland no longer feel distant. They are simply different expressions of the same truth. This planet is always rewriting itself. Across Zealandia's journey, from a piece of Gondwana to a lonely wanderer to a drowned continent, we realize that the lands still visible today are not islands at all. They are the remaining pages of a long book whose chapters have mostly been washed away. To read that book, we must turn to the fragments that still rise above the water, the dense forests of New Zealand, the birds that live as if time never moved, and the rivers that flow along the ridgelines of an ancient mountain range. That is where the story continues, a world waiting to be rediscovered. For decades, Zealandia lay beneath the ocean like a secret no one bothered to question. Old maps marked the waters east of Australia with a flat expanse of blue, as if nothing existed on the seafloor but sediment and darkness. Then came new generations of survey vessels, not searching for undiscovered lands, but for lands that had already been lost. Advanced sonar, deep seismic imaging, and gravity mapping satellites began peeling back the layers of the ocean floor. Each scan, each gravity map, felt like the slow opening of a long sleeping eyelid of the planet. There was no cinematic moment of discovery, only data, thousands of gigabytes revealing drowned ridges, submerged valleys, and ancient stones lifted from drill cores like the bones of a body buried underwater. Inside those rock samples was a simple truth, powerful enough to stop researchers in their tracks. Zealandia once stood above the sea. Wind-shaped mineral grains, moisture-rich sediments, fossilized pollen resembling Gondwanan forests, all of them told the same quiet story. There had been rain here, wind, valleys, dense green forests no human eyes had ever seen. Projects like the IODP drilled deep around New Zealand and New Caledonia, pulling up fragments of history buried for tens of millions of years. With every core sample, another page of memory was restored. And as the data accumulated, the outline of Zealandia grew sharper, fault lines stretching like the wrinkles of time, underwater mountain ranges rising like the spine of an ancient sleeping creature, and shadowed valleys lying beneath thousands of meters of water, echoes of lands that once felt the touch of rain. To discover Zealandia was never to find a new world. It was to return a continent to human memory. Not to expand our map of the future, but to restore a piece of the past erased by the sea. And from that restoration, a larger question surfaced. If a continent nearly 5 million square kilometers in size can vanish so completely that science only recognized it in the 21st century, how many other lands have disappeared quietly while humans still wandered the earth? That question pulls us away from the Pacific and toward the north, to a world that once connected two continents, served as a migration highway for early humans, and nurtured enormous Ice Age creatures. A land now reduced to cold winds and frozen silence. Its name is Beringia, and that is where our journey continues. When we speak of Beringia, most of us picture a narrow, frozen strip of land linking Asia to the Americas, a temporary ice bridge that our ancestors crossed and left behind. But that image is only the smallest shadow of a far greater truth. Beringia was not a bridge, it was a continent, a world wide enough, rich enough, and enduring enough to sustain both humans and animals for thousands of years. Imagine a land where winter brings only a thin silver glow across the sky, while summer stretches out like a sunrise that never ends. Winds sweep across plains as vast as seas, and grasses, some of the most nutritious of the entire Ice Age, spread all the way to the edge of the horizon. This was Beringia, a frozen kingdom of earth and light, where the darkness of winter and the brightness of summer breathed in the same slow rhythm. Far from being barren, Beringia was one of the most thriving ecosystems of the Ice Age. Woolly mammoths, woolly rhinos, wild horses, saiga antelope, ancient bison, and saber-toothed cats lived here. Some species even treated Beringia as their true homeland rather than a migration corridor. Caught between two massive ice sheets, Siberia and North America, yet never covered by ice itself, Beringia was a gigantic oasis of steppe in the middle of a frozen desert. Humans did not simply cross Beringia, they lived there, hunted there, and shaped memory in its wind-carved valleys. Modern DNA reveals that the ancestors of indigenous Americans stayed in Beringia for thousands of years before moving on, a period scientists call the Beringian standstill. For them, Beringia was not a passage, it was home. If we stood in Beringia 20,000 years ago, we would never think of it as a border between continents. We would be standing on a unified landmass where wild horses ran to the summer horizon and winter nights shimmered with purple and blue auroras draped like ribbons across the sky. Ancient families huddled around fires against the cold, sharing the day's hunt while the wind whispered across the grass, like the voices of long-gone ancestors. When the ice melted and sea levels rose more than 120 meters, Beringia began to disappear. Not with a single flood, but through countless seasons of thaw, countless times the sea pushed into valleys once walked by human feet. The first groups moved gradually southward, carrying with them the memory of a world that had sustained them for generations. Today, when we look at the frigid Bering Sea, it is hard to imagine that beneath those waves mammoth herds once moved like rolling surf, and early humans once tended their fires while waiting for the dawn of a new continent. Beringia did not simply connect Asia and America, it connected two chapters of human evolution. And like Doggerland and Sunderland, it sank, leaving behind only faint traces in the sediment and in the DNA of millions of people. But Beringia is only one chapter in a far larger book, a book about the worlds that once existed and then vanished as Earth rewrote itself. And as Beringia dissolved into the sea, another chapter, farther south, broader, older, waited to be rediscovered. A forgotten continent. A world that once stretched beneath the southern sky. A name whispered through time. Sahul, the forgotten southern world. If Beringia was known as the continent of endless grass, then the ice margins, the frontier where land met the wall of permanent ice, were an entirely different world. This was a fragile kingdom, yet one full of quiet strength, where life survived not through power, but through endurance and adaptation. These icy edges were the boundary between winter's darkness and summer's light, between the silence of ice and the breath of the steppe. It was a place where life did not disappear, but refined itself. In our imagination, the Ice Age is often a still, white curtain. But the ice margins were where life gathered most intensely. The first sunlight of spring, the nutrient-rich grasslands, and the great herds searching for survival. It was here that ancient humans proved a remarkable resilience. Mammoths were not just icons of prehistory, they were pillars of this entire ecosystem. Towering nearly 3 meters tall, they walked like living engines that warmed the steppe, clearing paths for horses, bison, and reindeer. For humans, mammoths were everything: meat for survival, hides for shelter, fat to burn through sunless nights, and ivory for tools that shaped their world. And from mammoths, humans learned a vital lesson. Survival was not achieved by fighting nature, but by following its rhythm. Beringia had no great forests or fertile soil, but it had what mattered most: steady food, water that never fully froze, and summers that stretched almost endlessly. In a landscape that seemed unforgiving, humans built a culture defined by its durability. Low shelters braced against the wind, fire buried in pits to protect the embers, and tools so precise they still astonish us today. Thin obsidian blades, lightweight spears, craftsmanship born from necessity. Modern DNA shows that the ancestors of indigenous Americans lived in Beringia for a long time before continuing their journey. They did not simply pass through, they lived, endured, and trusted the land. A part of their resilience remains in the bodies of millions today, a thin thread of inherited memory. As winters and summers passed, they left small but lasting traces, animal bones, stone tools, and the deep silence of nights spent waiting for the aurora to dance. Though they had no writing, they must have carried stories, songs, and rituals for the sun, the one force that lifted them through long months of darkness. Then the ice melted. The sea rose, not with a roar, but with a quiet retreat. Grass sinking beneath water, valleys becoming bays, plains turning into seafloor. The last people to leave Beringia probably never realized their continent was disappearing. They only saw the land changing shape and kept walking, as generations before them had. And in that moment, we understand. Beringia is not only the story of a drowned land, it is the story of human endurance. The ability to face cold winds and still find a path, to see beauty in hardship, and to persist until even nature must yield. That same endurance would carry humanity to the next lost world, the one that once connected Australia, New Guinea, and Tasmania, where some of the oldest footprints on Earth still press into ancient soil. Another world, deeper, older, and vast enough to stand as a continent of its own. The story opens with a name that echoes like distant drums. Sahul, the Southern Ark. No tragedy of the Ice Age happened in a single moment. There were no tsunamis wiping everything clean, no dramatic cracking of continents, like the stories humans would tell many thousands of years later. The disappearance of Beringia, the grassland continent stretching from Siberia to Alaska, unfolded with a gentleness almost polite, quiet, gradual, and utterly unstoppable. At first, it was nothing more than a slightly longer summer, a patch of ice melting sooner, a river running a bit shallower, exposing more damp earth. These changes were so small that no one paid them much attention. For the people of Beringia, nature always changed its clothing with the season. Winds shifted, grasses changed color, ice altered its shape. No one knew these tiny signs were the first breaths of a monumental cycle. A few generations later, the sea began slipping into the valleys, not as violent waves, but as shallow pools of salt water that lingered a little longer each year. Places where mammoths once moved like rolling waves of grass slowly turned into cold marshland. The nutrient-rich steppe began to thin. Then the rivers, the arteries of the continent, changed course. They carved new paths through plains that had grown heavy with moisture. Freshwater lakes grew brackish, grass disappeared, and the vast world that had supported countless herds began turning year by year into a wide mirror of water each time the ice thawed. No one called it a sinking continent. They simply said things like, "This season is different from the last." But the sea never stopped. It advanced with patience, as if it already knew that in the end the land would yield. It rose inch by inch, meter by meter, until the entire region that humans and mammoths had shared for thousands of years became nothing more than a frigid seafloor. When the water reached its highest point, Beringia, larger than many modern nations, vanished completely. Not with a roar, but with the absolute silence of an ancient rule. No continent lives forever. No coastline remains unchanged. No map is permanent. What we call land is only a temporary chapter in Earth's long book. Some chapters last tens of millions of years, some only a few thousand, but all eventually close. Earth is always rewriting itself. Humans, meanwhile, pass through only a few short lines of the story. And knowing this, we see Beringia differently. Not as a land erased, but as a symbol of geological impermanence, a reminder that every continent, no matter how vast, will one day return to the sea. The last people to leave Beringia likely had no idea they were saying farewell to a continent. They only saw shrinking hunting grounds, shifting water sources, and animals moving farther afield. And they kept walking, just as their ancestors had always done, carrying with them not maps or writing, but the one thing that could never sink, the resilience of the human spirit. That resilience carried them forward, opening the next chapter in the story of the Americas. Beringia vanished, but the spirit of its people spread into DNA, into culture, into the migration paths still visible in the modern world. And that same endurance leads us to the next land, a continent larger than modern Southeast Asia, one that once connected Australia, New Guinea, and Tasmania into a single mass. A world filled with extraordinary creatures, and a place where humans left the oldest footprints outside Africa. Another submerged continent waits for us. A southern world from deep prehistory. Its story begins with a name that echoes like a call from the distant past. Sahul, the Southern Ark. When Beringia sank and its people spread into the Americas, the story of that continent did not truly end. It simply left the surface of the earth and continued in the only medium capable of crossing thousands of generations: human memory. Not memory carved into stone or written on hide, but memory kept alive in stories, in songs, in firelit nights where elders passed down the shape of a world far larger than anything a modern map would dare to show. In the far north, the Inuit recall a land where the sun goes down, a place where great animals once moved like living waves. They do not use the word Beringia, but they speak of grasslands now gone, of riverbanks that remain only in the mind. For them, the world never changed with disaster. It simply turned a natural page. Across Siberia, the Chukchi share tales that echo the same idea, journeys across plains that no longer exist, where winds once swept through endless steppe, and the footsteps of animals could be heard from miles away. They speak of land eaten slowly by water, of rivers that once linked the sea to the grasslands before everything became narrow bays filled with drifting ice. Strangely, their imagery mirrors modern scientific models of how Beringia disappeared. Farther inland, the Athabascan remember a land so wide no one could travel across it, where the summer sun stretched endlessly, refusing to set. But what stands out is how they describe it, not as a place of cold, but of abundance, herds of animals, dependable food, and the feeling of a world open in every direction. These stories, though separated by cultures and continents, move with the same rhythm. There was once a vast land, and it vanished not in chaos, but in a pattern their ancestors could observe, but never fully understand. And this leads to a deeper idea. Myth is often the science of people who had no written language. They saw the sea change, the land withdraw, the climate shift. And to keep from forgetting, they told it again and again. What surprises us even more is that the motif of land swallowed by the sea appears everywhere. In the Pacific, Hawaii; in the Indian Ocean, Lemuria; in Europe, Doggerland; in Southeast Asia, Sunderland; and in southern India, those memories were preserved in a language with extraordinary endurance, Tamil. In the ancient Sangam corpus, poetry more than 2,000 years old. Southern poets describe a vast land to the south of India, a place where early Dravidian culture flourished. A land of rivers, early cities, prosperous communities, and then a land slowly claimed by the sea, piece by piece. They gave this vanished world a name both beautiful and sorrowful, Kumari Kandam. Some traditions speak of 3 great floods, others tell of 9 submerged regions, but all point to the same loss, a world that once existed, now surviving only in memory. And when we set Tamil memory beside the stories of Alaska and Siberia, something remarkable happens. Tales from opposite ends of the world begin to illuminate each other. Beringia, Dogaland, Sunderland, Lemuria, Kumari Kandam all reflect the same rule we have encountered again and again on this journey. Land rises, land sinks, and what remains is not stone but memory. That is why Kumari Kandam is more than a Dravidian legend. It is a piece of a global pattern, the pattern of continents erased from the surface, yet preserved in culture. To understand it fully, to see Kumari Kandam not as a poetic tale of southern India, but as part of the same geological cycle that shaped Sunderland, Lemuria, and Beringia, we must enter the next chapter. A chapter where myth meets bedrock, where ancient poetry meets shifting tides, where human memory meets the silent movements of the earth. And that story begins here. Kumari Kandam, the lost cradle of the south. Among all the legends of lands swallowed by the sea, 2 stories refuse to fade, Atlantis in the west and Kumari Kandam in the south. They do not meet in geography or culture, yet they intersect at something far more delicate. They belong to a kind of memory humanity refuses to let go of. These 2 silhouettes move through time, cross religions and borders, and survive long after people stopped believing in literal myth. And still, they never disappear. Atlantis exists only in a few short passages by Plato, yet it became a global symbol of a civilization drowned beneath the waves. Kumari Kandam is different. It does not appear in a single narrative, but flows quietly through hundreds of ancient Sangam poems, through rituals, through the collective memory of the Tamil people, one of the world's most enduring cultures. They do not ask, was Kumari Kandam real? They ask, what part of Kumari Kandam still lives within us? And that question alone speaks to the power of memory. According to Tamil tradition, Kumari Kandam was a vast landmass south of the Indian subcontinent, a place of great rivers, fertile plains, and early centres of learning, poetry, and moral thought. Not an empire, but a cultural cradle, a world where the Tamil language was treated almost like a form of light. The strangest part of this legend lies in how the land disappeared, not through a single catastrophe, but through a long sequence of rising seas, pieces of land cut away and lost one after another. Sangam poets write of 3 coastal cities swallowed, of 9 regions taken by the ocean, of people retreating step by step as the waters advanced. Each verse feels like a soft note of mourning, a shadow cast by a world no one can touch anymore. Placed beside Sunderland, Dogaland or Beringia, Kumari Kandam falls into the same rhythm. Vast land, rising sea, memory remaining. The only difference is the Tamil people never forgot. They kept it in language, in ritual, in culture. That sense of loss became part of their identity. What keeps Kumari Kandam alive is not just the idea of a drowned land, but the way its memory is preserved through language. Tamil, one of the oldest living languages on Earth, carries within it melodies, symbols, and phonetic patterns that many believe echo from that vanished southern world. In the way they sing, the way they pray, the way they write about nature, there is always a faint outline of a land that no one has seen for thousands of years. So Kumari Kandam is more than a myth. It is a cultural metaphor for loss, an echo of what vanished from the earth but never vanished from the heart. Atlantis survives because it ignites imagination. Kumari Kandam survives because it nourishes longing. Looking at sea level maps from 18,000 years ago, something quietly astonishing appears. The ancient coastline extended far more to the south than the modern one. Set that alongside Sunderland in Southeast Asia and the many microcontinents submerged in the Indian Ocean, and a larger picture emerges. Ancient coastal cultures around India carried memories of land being slowly taken by the sea. This places Kumari Kandam in the same family as Doggerland, Sunderland and Beringia, not as a geological continent, but as a collective memory of what slipped beyond the horizon. And when a memory stays long enough, becomes the spiritual foundation of an entire people, it stops being a simple myth. It becomes another kind of truth, truth of emotion, of culture, of inherited memory. Atlantis is a warning. Kumari Kandam is a remembrance. One belongs to Greek philosophy. The other belongs to the Dravidian heart, and both whisper the same message. The earth creates land, and the earth takes it back. But one question remains unanswered. If Kumari Kandam is the southern memory of a land that might once have existed, what made that memory strong enough to survive across millennia? What did that land experience, if it truly existed at all? And beneath the deep waters of the Indian Ocean, what still waits in silence to be seen? Among the boldest ideas surrounding Kumari Kandam, there is one thought that outsiders often misunderstand, yet it reflects the Tamil spirit with remarkable clarity. The belief that southern India, through this lost land, might have been the birthplace of some of humanity's oldest linguistic roots, not a literal origin of all languages, nor a claim meant to rewrite global history, but a cultural way of explaining the strange endurance of Tamil, the one thing that neither the sea nor time has been able to erase. For a people who believed the ground beneath them once disappeared into the ocean, language became an anchor of memory. The Tamil view of this is not pride alone. It is almost a kind of longing, a sense that there was once a world larger, older, and deeper than what remains today. In Tamil thought, the Tamil language is not just a medium of communication, but a continuous river flowing from a distant age, older than the empires that later rose and fell across the Indian subcontinent. Modern linguistics does not support the idea that Tamil is the mother of all languages, but it also cannot deny something essential. Tamil is one of the oldest living languages, and it has evolved with an independence rarely seen in human history. Look at the map of languages and something almost paradoxical emerges. Tamil has no close relatives around it, not Indo-Aryan, not Munda, not Sino-Tibetan or Austroasiatic. The Dravidian family stands apart like a continental fragment, the Zealandia of linguistics, ancient, resilient, and surrounded by younger language groups that swept across most of the subcontinent. This isolated yet enduring nature led Tamil communities to ask a simple question. If our language resembles no other, where did it come from? The answer they found, symbolic more than geographic, was Kumari Kandam, a primordial southern land where they believe their ancestors once lived before the sea swallowed rivers, villages, and the earliest schools of thought. Science cannot confirm Kumari Kandam as a literal continent, of course. Yet science does reveal something else. The Dravidian languages emerged in southern India very early enough to avoid the influence of the major linguistic currents that later swept through the region. This does not prove the legend, but it opens a clear possibility. Southern India may have been a cultural center far older than mainstream history acknowledges, so when the Tamil people say their origin lies to the south, where the ocean now covers the ancient land, they are not debating geology, they are speaking the language of collective memory. The Sangam poems describe Kumari Kandam not as a mythical paradise, but as a very real world. Rivers, artisans, scholars, and coastal cities that flourished before being separated and erased by rising seas. These descriptions turn Kumari Kandam into a story not about glorifying the past, but about preserving what the ocean took away. Placed beside Atlantis, the contrast becomes striking. Human beings have always sensed that their beginnings lie in a world larger than the one they stand on now. Atlantis is a story about downfall. Kumari Kandam is a story about loss. One belongs to Greek philosophy, the other to the Dravidian heart. Atlantis captivates through mystery. Kumari Kandam endures through remembrance. And both whisper the same truth. When the earth takes land, it leaves no stone behind, only language. Language is the one thing light enough to float across the sea, strong enough to survive time, and deep enough to hold the outline of a world that has vanished. We've explored Kumari Kandam through poetry and tradition, but the next question turns sharper, more tangible. If remnants of that world exist, where are they? Could clues still lie beneath the waters south of India, in ancient sediments, buried river channels, or the faint geometries of lost coastlines? The story continues where geology meets legend, where the floor of the Indian Ocean sends up signals like the oldest memories of the South rising slowly toward the light. When we go deep enough into the story of Kumari Kandam, we eventually reach a moment that's impossible to avoid. The moment when myth and science have to stand in the same room. Not to contradict each other and not to fight for the right version of the past, but to acknowledge something simple and unsettling. Each of them holds only part of the truth, and the rest lies in the quiet space between them. Science states clearly there is no evidence of a giant continent beneath the Indian Ocean in any period close to human history. But legend tells a different story, a vast Tamil homeland, rich in culture and learning, gradually surrendering itself to the sea. These two claims appear to clash, but if we listen more carefully, we realize they aren't denying each other at all. They're speaking about two different kinds of loss. Geology, in its language of stone and time, describes the Indian Ocean as a young oceanic crust, a place unlikely to preserve large intact continents. And yet geology also records strange disruptions: Mauritius, the Seychelles, Madagascar, fragments of microcontinents torn away from Gondwana and scattered like pages from a book thrown into the sea. This doesn't prove Kumari Kandam, but it does open a door, the possibility that broad stretches of land once existed along the southern coast of India, only to be drowned piece by piece as sea levels rose over thousands of years. And this is exactly where myth begins to speak. The Sangam poets never describe a continent in the scientific sense. They write, instead of coastal plains eroding under the tide, riverside cities disappearing one by one, fertile lands becoming coves and bays, and that slow, incremental loss, the sea rising softly, the land shrinking in fragments, mirrors with uncanny accuracy what happened to Doggerland, to Sunderland, to ancient Pacific shorelines. So perhaps Kumari Kandam was never a continent like Plato's Atlantis. Perhaps it was the memory of a coastline that once extended far beyond today's beaches, a world where people lived, farmed, traded, and remembered before watching it slip beneath the waves. A real event told in the language of legend. Science asks, if it existed, where are the remains? Legend replies, if it sank 10,000 years ago, what remains could survive? Between these two questions lies a silence, a space no map, no poem, no research paper can fill. A space that belongs not to science or myth, but to humility, to the recognition that our understanding of the world will always be incomplete. Geology is not wrong to say there is no ancient megacontinent under the Indian Ocean. Tamil tradition is not wrong to recall lands swallowed by the sea. The difference lies only in the scale and in the storytelling. And when we stop seeing these two perspectives as opponents, something beautiful appears. Science gives us the shape of the earth, but myth gives us the soul of the people who lived upon it. Between those two currents, we stand still for a moment, not to choose a side, but to ask, how many ancient landscapes of humanity would we ever know about, if not for memory? If Doggerland had not left tools in fishing nets, would we believe it existed? If Zealandia had not emerged on sonar maps, would we call it a continent? If indigenous DNA had not preserved the echo of Beringia, would we know a land once lay between two worlds? So perhaps the right question is not, was Kumari Kandam real? But, how far are we willing to expand our definition of the past? And from this quiet space, where science and myth stop arguing and simply pause, a new direction emerges, not a hunt for a lost supercontinent, but a search for the traces that any great loss inevitably leaves behind, in the sediment, in the geography, in the culture, in the long thread connecting humanity to the sea, which leads to a single guiding question for what comes next. If Kumari Kandam left physical traces, where are they now? In which seafloor, along which ancient coastlines, hidden inside which geological anomalies off the southern tip of India? The story continues here, where ocean and memory meet, and the floor of the Indian Ocean begins to reveal faint, patient signals from a world that has disappeared. If there is one thing that sets Kumari Kandam apart from every other lost land, it isn't its imagined size or its mythical position on ancient maps. It's the durability of its memory. Long after kingdoms faded, after empires vanished, after religions rose and fell, the memory of Kumari Kandam remained anchored in Tamil consciousness. Like a shoreline the ocean could never fully erase, even though the sea claimed it ages ago. No one knows where its ancient rivers once flowed. No one stands on those vanished plains anymore. There are no maps, no inscriptions, no physical traces, and yet it has not disappeared. In the Sangam epics, the Tamil poets speak of a land to the south where three great rivers met on a wide plain. They describe coastal cities swallowed as the water rose season after season, and broad stretches of earth retreating into the sea as if the ocean were merely taking back what had always belonged to it. These poems are not geological records or timelines, yet their geographic sensitivity is striking. The feeling of a world once vast, now surviving only in words. Modern scholars often call these verses metaphors, but for the Tamil people, metaphor is the vessel that carries memory when history has been erased. And it isn't only poetry that preserves the story, symbols do as well. Stone carvings in Tamil Nadu show the sea lifting the land, reminders that water is not an enemy, but a rhythm the southern world has always lived beside. Some reliefs even depict coastlines that don't match modern geography, as if the sculptors were rebuilding a place they never saw but had heard about since childhood. In Tamil festivals and folk songs, echoes of the land that sank in the south still move through the melodies. No one demands proof. The memory survives because it is repeated, nurtured, and treated as part of identity. It lives not through maps, but through hearts that continue to believe that such a place once held their distant ancestors. When we look at how the Tamil people protect this memory, a strange realization appears. The world may change, shores may shift, but once a landscape attaches itself to human imagination, it becomes harder to erase than stone. And this is why Kumari Kandam begins to resemble another legend more than any other, Atlantis. Two lands from two separate traditions, two different corners of the world, yet both preserved by the same force, persistence in collective memory. Atlantis endures because of its unanswered questions. Kumari Kandam endures because of a grief too subtle to name, the grief of a people who lost too much to the sea. One was ignited by Plato as philosophical allegory, the other was carried by Tamil culture as ancestral memory, and both reflect a deeply human truth. Lands taken by the ocean often live longer in memory than they ever did in reality. And when we place Kumari Kandam beside Beringia, Doggerland, Sunderland, and Lemuria, the lost lands we've walked through in this journey, we suddenly see a continuous thread. Humanity's memories of sinking worlds didn't begin with Atlantis. They began with countless communities who watched the ocean change before their eyes. Doggerland is remembered through tools pulled from fishing nets. Sunderland is remembered through ancient Southeast Asian myth. Beringia is remembered through the DNA of native peoples of the Americas. And Kumari Kandam is remembered through poetry, festivals, and songs that never stopped being sung. Atlantis is simply the brightest lamp, but never the first. And just as the memory of Kumari Kandam begins to close, another memory, larger, more famous, and endlessly debated, begins to open. Not to retell Atlantis the way the world already knows it, but to see it with new light, not as a standalone legend, but as one chapter in a long chain of drowned landscapes humanity refuses to forget. A myth mentioned more than any other, yet also one of the most misunderstood in all of human history. Long before Plato opened his mouth to tell a story about a vanished land, humanity had already spent thousands of years watching the sea the way one watches a restless spirit. Coastal peoples saw shorelines shift, saw waves creep into fields, saw river mouths change course within the span of a few generations. They had no writing, but they had memory. Memory strong enough to pass down one simple truth: land is not permanent. And it was in this world, long before Greek philosophy existed, that stories of disappearing lands first began to take shape. Plato came only at the end. He did not invent Atlantis out of emptiness. He reached into a current of memory that had been flowing long before him. In his writings, he claims that Solon, the Greek lawgiver, heard the tale from Egyptian priests in the city of Say. It is impossible to verify that chain of transmission, but it reveals something important. The memory of a drowned land had traveled farther and deeper than any single civilization. And when we widen our view, that truth becomes too obvious to debate. In South India, Tamil tradition preserves the memory of Kumari Kandam, a land slowly swallowed by rising seas. In Southeast Asia, Austronesian memory speaks of Sunderland, where ancient rivers once ran across plains now drowned. In Europe, Celtic legend remembers Lyonesse, where church bells still ring beneath the waves. Across the Pacific, Polynesians recall Hawaii, the ancestral homeland beyond the horizon. The Japanese speak of Yonaguni, the Maya of Aztlan, the Sumerians of Dilmun. None of these stories match each other in detail, yet every one of them points the same way. The world was once larger, and ancient coastlines reached far beyond the borders we see today. Plato was simply the first to take these scattered echoes and shape them into a philosophical narrative, turning the collective longing of many cultures into a story with form and structure. Seen through the lens of geology, these myths grow even less fantastical. During the last 15,000 years of the Ice Age, sea level rose more than 120 meters. In geological time, that is a blink. In human time, it is the moment the entire world changed shape. Coastal plains, at the very places where early humans lived and gathered food, vanished by the decade, by the century. These memories required no shining empire, no glorious civilization, only enough witnesses and enough sorrow. Through his retelling of Atlantis, Plato did not resurrect a lost super-civilization. He gathered the distant echoes of many drowned worlds and arranged them into a story that could survive on the page. And because of that, the real question is not, where did Plato hear this? But rather, why do so many cultures, separated by oceans and centuries, all speak of a land that sank? Maybe because they saw the same things. Maybe because the sea took more than we realize. Or maybe, deep within humanity's oldest memories, there has always been an empty space, a space shaped like the land our ancestors once stood upon and watched disappear under the waves. When Plato spoke of Atlantis, he wasn't conjuring the glittering fantasy city we see in modern retellings. He described it as a radiant moment in human history, a time when society briefly achieved a rare balance of wisdom, restraint, and strength. The power of Atlantis doesn't come from magic. It comes from the feeling that it was a world close to ideal, and that it vanished only when human beings lost their sense of equilibrium. According to Plato, the island lay beyond the Pillars of Hercules, wide enough for mountains, plains, and a central city built in concentric rings. There was no labyrinth of divine tricks, no supernatural architecture. That design was simply a symbol of order, a philosophical diagram of a society that governed itself with discipline before collapsing under its own excess. And strangely, that vision echoes many of the lost worlds we've already walked through. Doggerland once had rivers and coastal communities until it disappeared beneath rising seas. Sunderland stretched across Southeast Asia and then drowned as the post-Ice Age ocean rose. Beringia fed herds and people for millennia, then melted into a cold, silent strait. Zealandia had forests and rivers. Now 94% of it lies underwater. Kumari Kandam survives in Tamil memory as a brilliant land slowly eaten by the sea. All different, yet sharing the same outline. Worlds that flourished in their own way and faded when Earth shifted its tempo. Placed beside them, Atlantis stops looking like an anomaly. It becomes one more variation of a story humanity has lived through again and again, only this time expressed as philosophy. What truly sets Atlantis apart is the layer of meaning Plato wove into it, the fall. The Atlanteans, in his account, were not destroyed by waves alone. They crumbled beneath their own ambition. The land becomes a metaphor. When a civilization loses moderation, nature will correct it in its own way. But read closely and you'll see Plato never describes a sudden, catastrophic deluge. What he really captures is the feeling of a world slipping away too fast. In the years after the Ice Age, a region could vanish in a single lifetime, fast for people, slow for the planet. That very thing happened in Doggerland, in Sunderland, and along ancient Tamil coasts. Perhaps Plato wasn't speaking of violent waves at all. Perhaps he was speaking of collapse, the kind humans fail to understand until it's over. When we place Atlantis beside the world's other memories, Lyonesse of the Celts, Hawaii of Polynesia, Aztlan of the Maya, Kumari Kandam of the Tamils, an invisible thread begins to emerge. All of them carry the same sensation. The world was once larger than the world we see today. It is that feeling, not ruins, that keeps Atlantis alive. Plato's Atlantis was never the origin of lost land myths. It was simply the brightest mirror, the most fully articulated expression of a memory far older than him. A memory spoken in hundreds of languages under different skies, yet always returning to the same motif. The sea does not only take land, it takes away humanity's sense of certainty. And when we walk through all those stories, Doggerland, Sunderland, Beringia, Kumari Kandam, Atlantis rises not as a mystery to be solved, but as the meeting point between memory and philosophy. A place where humans distilled their own fragility into a single narrative. So the real question is not where was Atlantis? The real question is, why do people everywhere remember a drowned land, a shared memory that crosses all languages, civilizations, and oceans? And the journey toward that answer begins where the myth of Atlantis is taken apart, revealing the pattern beneath it, a pattern humanity has seen many times, but Plato was the one who finally gave it a name. When we look back at Atlantis, the reason the story endures has nothing to do with circular cities or the layers of myth added centuries later. It survives because it evokes something deeply familiar. The realization that the disappearance of a society is not rare at all. Atlantis is just one bright thread woven into a far larger tapestry. The tapestry Earth has been making for tens of thousands of years, filled with lands that were once whole, then quietly sank as the planet changed its rhythm. And when we tug at that thread, we find it connects to a pattern far bigger than Atlantis itself. Every collapse carries the same cadence, even if each culture tells it differently. The place to begin is sea level, the silent witness of the Ice Age. Between 20,000 and 8,000 years before the Common Era, Earth emerged from its long cold. Ice did not melt evenly, it surged in bursts. Meltwater, pulse 1A, then 1B, then regional catastrophes like the Storegga slide in the North Atlantic. These weren't small rises. Some were 10 or 20 meters of water within a few centuries, far too fast for coastal cultures whose lives depended on where the shoreline stood. Sundaland shrank like a map being erased piece by piece. Doggerland lost entire regions in a single moment when Storegga collapsed into the sea. Beringia was swallowed season by season as summer meltwater returned. And when Plato wrote of one day and one night of misfortune, perhaps he was distilling the shock of peoples who had watched their world change colour within a single lifetime. But rising seas were not the only force shaping the fate of ancient worlds. The Mediterranean, the long curve from Greece to Turkey, from Sicily down to North Africa, is where crustal plates grind, lift, and sink land again and again. It has known some of the largest earthquakes in human memory. It has seen eruptions strong enough to redraw coastlines. Thera is the clearest example. The explosion around 1600 before the Common Era sent tsunamis outward and warped the seascape so dramatically that entire coastal towns vanished from history. The Minoans on Crete did not collapse from ash alone, but from the combined failure of sea, land, and commerce. Even Alexandria later lost much of its harbour from twin earthquakes. These fragments reveal something simple but profound. If Atlantis had any historical core at all, its disappearance would fit perfectly within the natural forces that have reshaped Earth over and over again. When we link Doggerland, Sunderland, Beringia, Kumarikandam, and Zealandia, a pattern crystallizes. Land is never fixed, the sea is never a permanent boundary, and coastal peoples, whether in Europe, Asia, or the Pacific, have all watched their familiar horizons bend and drift. Atlantis, in this light, is not an odd outlier. It is a reflex of the shared human memory, the memory of lands people loved, trusted, and then watched disappear. The depth of Plato's telling comes from how he shaped that memory into a warning. Prosperity cannot endure if people forget their own limits. He wasn't merely recounting a city. He was describing a feeling. The feeling of standing at an edge while the world changes too fast to comprehend. Seen within the full picture, from the frozen north of Europe to the drowned plains of ancient Southeast Asia, the truth becomes clear, as soft as a passing breeze. No civilization collapses alone, no land escapes the laws of the planet, and no single mystery stands outside the long geological tide. Earth rewrites its maps, and the sea always answers in its own language. So Atlantis, brighter, louder, more famous, yet never truly alone, becomes just one chapter in the long archive of worlds that once existed. The real question is not, where was Atlantis, but how many other worlds sank before we ever learned to see them? And that question leads us into the search for what remains, not only of Atlantis, but of every lost continent lying quiet beneath the sea. When we look back on the entire journey, from the plains now drowned beneath the North Sea to the grass kingdom erased by ice in the far north, from the valleys of Southeast Asia now lying silent under warm waters, to the Tamil memories of a southern world, from the quiet continent of Zealandia beneath the Pacific to the Atlantis retold through Greek philosophy, we begin to see that each land once thought to be a separate mystery is actually part of a single, larger current, a current that belongs not to any one place but to the way Earth moves and the way humans remember. The Earth has never stood still. Continents are not solid monuments, but drifting rafts of stone sliding past one another in the dark, slow motion of geological time. One place is pulled downward, another is lifted. Ice gathers the oceans into itself for an age, then releases them in the next. Each cycle compresses enormous changes into movements humans only notice when it is already too late. And that is what forms the pattern. Change always begins softly, slowly, until one final generation realizes the horizon is no longer where it used to be. What survives after each disappearance is not stone, not monuments. The sea erases those far faster than it erases the memory of the people who once lived there. What endures is the story they carry forward. As the ancestors of the Americas left Beringia, they carried with them the memory of summer light shimmering across the ice-edge plains. The Sunda peoples remembered broad riverlands now resting deep underwater. The Tamils sang of a southern realm swallowed tide by tide. The Celts whispered of a city where church bells still echo beneath the waves. The Polynesians preserved the name of a homeland fading behind long ocean voyages. The memories differ, but they point in the same direction, toward a world that once had a different shape. And if we study these stories closely, we find a structure repeated with stunning consistency. A wide and stable land, communities rising along its rivers and coastlines, the rhythm of nature shifting, people compelled to move, and a thread of memory surviving longer than any ruin. No culture invented this structure. They simply repeated what happened beneath their feet. And that repetition formed a kind of shared language, the language of disappearing land. The deeper truth is here. Myths of sunken continents may not be isolated tales, but different emotional responses to the same ancient loss. When the world shrank, humans expanded their memory to fill the space. When the sea took the land, they passed down its name. When they could no longer return, they built stories to protect the outline of a place that had vanished. This was never simple myth-making. It was memory fighting against erasure. And so, when we place all the fragments side by side, Doggerland, Sunderland, Beringia, Kumari Kandam, Zealandia, Atlantis, one realization rises gently, but with the weight of ages. The lost continents never truly disappeared. They simply changed residence from the surface of the earth to the memory of humankind. On geological maps they have dissolved into the sea, but on the cultural map they remain alive, in story, in song, in longing, in identity. And in that meeting point between the planet and the mind, we understand that the tale of lost continents was never a tale about land at all. It has always been a tale about us, about how we try to hold on to what the sea has taken, about our belief that our origins stretch wider than today's shorelines, and about the quiet truth that memory is the final continent, the one that can never drown. When we arrive at the end of this journey, a quiet truth rises on, soft as breath, yet echoing deeply. From the beginning we believed we were searching for lands that had vanished. Doggerland, Sunderland, Beringia, Kumari Kandam, Zealandia, Atlantis. But the farther we travelled, the clearer it became that what we were chasing was not the shorelines that sank, but the reason humanity never stopped remembering them. Some continents withdrew from the surface of the earth, but never from the human mind, and sometimes memory becomes the final form a land can take, a form even the ocean cannot drown. Doggerland survives in spearheads lifted from the seafloor, like messages sent late from prehistory. Sunderland lives on in Austronesian stories about a homeland pushed ever farther toward the horizon. Beringia hides in DNA, and in northern tales of grasslands no one could cross in a lifetime. Kumari Kandam endures in Tamil songs, prayers, and the way they name the ancestral south. Zealandia rises through shards of ancient rock from drilling cores, the shadow of a continent refusing to disappear. And Atlantis, held in only a few slender passages, survives on a question the world has never stopped asking. Placed side by side, these fragments turn into a quiet music, a song of humanity remembering the worlds it once belonged to. When the Ice Age melted and the seas climbed 120 meters higher, the ocean took more than land. It took the riverbanks where early humans watched the first sunrises. It took meadows that sustained the beginnings of life. It took villages at the water's edge where children's laughter mixed with the wind. It took the places where our ancestors first stepped out, hunted, lit fires, raised their young, buried their dead. When they could not keep the land, they kept its name. When they could not return, they carried its story. When they could not resist the sea, they turned memory into words and passed them forward. This is why when we speak of lost continents, we are not speaking only of geology or shifting coastlines. We are speaking about the shared human experience of watching the world shrink, of seeing waters rise, of feeling the shoreline pull away from familiar ground. The Sunda peoples watched the sea move into their plains. The Beringians saw grasslands turn into bays. Europeans witnessed wide territories vanish within a few generations. The Tamil saw sandbanks retreat season after season. The ancient Mediterraneans watched the earth crack and slide toward the sea. They did not share language or symbols, but they shared the same memory, that the world once had a far wider shape than the one we see today. And when we recognize this, we meet the final question, Abish, the one that has followed us from the beginning. How many worlds have disappeared that we have never named? How many cultures sank before they had the chance to write? How many stories slipped away before anyone could record them? How many cities rest quietly underwater, never known to have existed? How many ancient shorelines sleep beneath layers of sediment, waiting for a sonar pulse to trace their outline? Perhaps more than we imagine. Perhaps enough to form an entire second map, a map of invisible worlds still held gently in memory's hands. And perhaps the beauty of this journey lies not in finding each lost land, but in realizing that they never truly left us. Every time we speak of Atlantis, we are remembering Doggerland. Every time we tell the story of Sunderland, we touch the edge of Kumari Kandam. Every time we ask about Beringia, we are really asking where we came from. These continents, dissolved, drowned, erased from maps, live on in humanity's longing for origins and in the ache for what was lost. They endure because we continue to feel the emptiness left behind. Maybe that is what every myth of a sunken land is trying to say. We do not come only from land, we come from the memory of land. That memory appears in the stories we tell, in the way we gaze at the sea, in the quiet instinct that before this present world, there were older, wider, deeper worlds. Land can disappear, but memory cannot. And memory, fragile as mist, enduring as stone, becomes the final continent, the one that cannot be submerged, the continent within us, the continent shaped by longing and unanswered questions. And when we look at the map one last time, we finally understand. The lost continents were never truly lost. They simply moved from the surface of the earth into the memory of humankind.